Well, good morning. I hope this video finds you all well. I figured let's just roll on and do a little Emily Dickinson. So again, as I said, with Whitman, it's Dickinson who, along with Whitman, belongs on the right side of that semicolon. Because her poetry, like Whitman's, is innovative. It challenged the status quo. It explored and presented what poetry could do in a very highly individualistic sense. So I think Whitman and Dickinson share that profound idea of Emerson's in self-reliance, that ability and that willingness to trust their own intuition with regards to their art and not try to follow other trends and other popular forms in poetry. Now, Dickinson is probably a little more traditional than Whitman's poetry is, and we can get into that because she certainly does borrow from what's known as the common ballad hymn as far as the meter goes. If you think about your traditional hymns that you may have sung in church, hymns like Amazing Grace, they have that 8-6-8 metrical form, and by that I mean the syllables. In other words, it's Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. That's 8. That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now can see. So Dickinson does use some conventional forms in her poems, but oftentimes she subverts them. In other words, she's packaging the message in a traditional form, but the message itself may challenge traditions. She's a very clever, highly intelligent poet. So like Whitman, Dickinson spurned the conventions and the fixtures of poetry of her period. You see this term didactic that I have in bold. If something is didactic, it is created to communicate or to impart a certain morality, usually the prevailing culture's morality. And that's what much of 19th century poet is marked by, a very conventional morality, a affirmation of beliefs and values that are held by the majority. But as we pointed out, it's Whitman and Dickinson who sort of challenge those conventions, not only in their forms, in the way their poems look, but in the themes that they take on, and the language that they use to express those themes. She was a very enigmatic character, and you may have studied Dickinson, I'm aware, earlier in your academic life or in your own private reading, right? She's often thought of as sort of that spinster, sort of lonely, the nun of Amherst, right? Never married, lived in her parents' house her entire life, and with just a very few exceptions, lived most of her life there in Amherst, Massachusetts. But her poetry does exhibit an unflinching autonomy in that ultimate belief in who she is as an individual. And I think one of the reasons why her poems do this, and this is important for you to remember, is that her poems were never meant for publication. Now, that doesn't mean that she didn't want to be published, and she did publish just a handful of poems in her lifetime, but the majority of them, and we're talking about thousands of poems, were never published and were not meant to be published. She used poetry as a vehicle, as a means, right, to sort of work out her own thoughts, her own ideas, her own beliefs, desires, fears, through her art. And much in the same way that we might think of journaling today. So her poems reflect this, the self and the many sides of herself. And she left explicit directions to her sister, Lavinia, to burn all of her poems upon her death. And I, for one, am glad that Lavinia did not listen to her sister. Each of her poems, though, is marked. If we're thinking about characteristics of Dickinson's poetry, we can safely say that they are all short, right? They are, I don't think, very few exceed 50 lines. I mean, there may be 8 lines at most, as we'll see. So they are short. They're highly compressed. They are oftentimes intense, offering us some very profound and penetrating insight. Collectively, her poems reveal that we're working and reading a poet who is highly intelligent, one who looks deeply beyond the surface of things to try to understand the reality. The subject of her poetry ranges across a wide spectrum of experience, deeply rooted in the natural world, animals, birds, worms, snakes, the narrow fellow in the grass. Also, we see her write a lot about death, and students are always asking, what's this obsession with death? Why do poets in particular always seem to treat this theme? And I think really the short answer is because it's so universal, right? It's something that we all experience. It doesn't matter our station in life, the color of our skin, whether we are rich or poor, whether we lived 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years in the future. It is part of the human condition, and as such, it probably deserves some contemplation, right? Because what we think about death often can inform the way we choose to live our lives. She was born in Amherst, Massachusetts. Her father was a very prominent man in the community, a member of Congress, actually, briefly. Also sat on the board of Amherst College for decades. She had one brother and one sister. She had one excursion to what was known as the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, and this was basically a boarding school or a finishing school for girls in the 19th century. And she didn't do very well there. She didn't last very long because, as you might expect, someone of her nature was not quick to fall in line and to conform to the ideology of the larger society around her. And so when questioned by the headmistress there, to stand she asked the students who were sure of their salvation to stand and affirm that they believed that they were quote unquote saved, and Dickinson could not do that with a clear conscience, and she didn't, as I said, she didn't last very long there. One of the things to keep in mind when you're reading Dickinson's poetry is that she did not number them, she did not give them titles. Those numbers are affixed many years later by several different historians at different times have tried to go through and number them, each using a different approach. But as I said, most of them were written in her room, in her family home, there in Amherst, Massachusetts. They were never written expressly for publication, as I said, although she did share some of her poetry with friends and family. It was more of a private endeavor, right? A private body of work that she creates. So, as I mentioned, characteristics, they are very short, right? None of her poems exceed 50 lines. They are paradoxically or maybe oxymoronically, right? They are simple and complex, as we'll see. But in every poem, we see Dickinson's mind was a mind that was turned inward upon itself, right? If we're looking at themes in Dickinson's poems, we've talked about death and dying. Death and dying was not only beyond the universal quality of it that I've already mentioned. In the 19th century, death was a specter. Okay, there were a lot of people dying. Right? We didn't have antibiotics yet. A lot of women died during childbirth. There was a high infant mortality rate. Death was a specter in communities. So we also see her exploring the questions associated with religion and spirituality. At times, she can be subversive in her themes. In other words, questioning God, questioning his sovereignty. We often see her, as I mentioned earlier, employing, that is to say, using sort of that hymnal meter that she would be very, very familiar with growing up in a traditional New England congregation. There's a cynicism in a lot of her poems, too. We see that perspective come out, right? She's questioning the authenticity of human relationships, right? Where is honesty? Where is the integrity among human relationships? And we see her, as I said earlier, she is very much owes a debt of gratitude to the Romantics. That's why she's in this group, right? In that she is inspired by the natural world. It is a source of inspiration for her. It is a teacher, a consoler, and we'll see that in a lot of her poems as well. So let's look at a couple. Let's look at this one here. Much Madness is Divinest Sense. Great poem. It is a poem that celebrates self-reliance and nonconformity, and it's a poem that explains, as Emerson does in his essay Self-Reliance, right, the perils of nonconformity, right? Emerson will write, for nonconformity, right, the world will whip us, or words to that effect. So, I'll read it for you. Read along with me. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense, the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority. In this all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. Let's take the first 4 lines. Much madness is divinest sense. Right out of the gate, right, we see her questioning or giving us an unconventional point of view. Madness being divine? How can that be? Well, I think what she's saying is that to be labeled mad by society or society looks at individuals who behave differently as though they are mad, but Dickinson would be saying that's the divine inside of us, right? Much madness is divine sense to a discerning eye. Now, a discerning eye is one that looks carefully, and Dickinson had a discerning eye. And for her, she's saying that much madness is true divinity in her eye, right? Much sense, the starkest madness, right? So again, if you're making too much sense, the speaker here is saying that is madness. If you conform and you're just like everybody else in the way that you think and the way that you dress and the way that you go about your life, that's madness for Dickinson's speaker. So much madness is divinest sense. She's saying it's okay to be considered mad by, right, the the prevailing society. 'Tis the majority in this as all prevail. All right? So the majority, right? She's talking about society, right? The people that we have to interact with every day. Assent, in other words, if we agree, that's what assent means. If we agree and you are sane, right? Right? Don't buck the system. Just fall in line. Don't ask questions. This is the way we've always done it. This is the traditional way of thinking, of worshiping, of believing. Assent to all of those things, and society will consider you to be a sane person. Demur, you're straightway dangerous. To demur is to question, to resist, right? To be reluctant, to think twice, to be discerning. Demur, and you're straightway dangerous. In other words, if you do that, right, if you question, right, society will look upon you as being dangerous. What's wrong with you? Why are you acting that way? Why are you asking so many questions? Why don't you just go along with the crowd? And handled with a chain, right? If you go back to Emerson's essay, again, Self-Reliance, right? He lists out all those great people like Jesus, Galileo, Copernicus, all of these people who changed the course of human history. In their day, they were thought to be dangerous because they questioned mathematics, they questioned physics, they questioned religion. And all of the great people, right, the true game changers in society and in civilization, right, are always misunderstood. They're always thought to be crazy. And oftentimes they're persecuted. Oftentimes they're thrown in jail. Some are even crucified. All right. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. Let's just do one more. I was going to do two more, but this is too long already. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. This is Dr. Calatrello's favorite Dickinson poem. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplus. I just wear my wings, and instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along. I don't know how she does this. Yeah, some keep the Sabbath going to church, right? Not Dickinson. Where does she do it? She does it at home. She observes and keeps the Sabbath at home. Look what she does in the first 8 lines, right? Where she contrasts the man-made with the natural. And the man-made is artificial, and it's where conventional society go, right? They go to a church. They go to a sanctuary. They go one day, right, on Sunday, and they dress a certain way, and they behave a certain way, and there's a choir there, and there's an architectural dome, right, and they toll the bell for church, right. These are all man-made expressions of worship. But look what Dickinson says. I keep it at home, and I keep it every day, and I commune with nature, right? Instead of a choir, she has a bird, right? And I'd rather hear a bird sing than most choirs, to be honest. And instead of a dome and being inside, she's outside under a tree in her orchard, right? So she keeps the Sabbath in her own way. But it's the last stanza, you guys, that I I'm really drawn to. She says, God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. God preaches when she's there, right, in the natural world, and the sermon is never long. That sounds pretty good to me. So instead of getting to heaven at last, don't miss this, I am going all along. These last two lines, look what she does, you guys. In 2 lines, she takes on this huge theological question about heaven, right? Heaven traditionally is something that you get to. It's a destination, right? You only get a glimpse of it if you've behaved well during life and after you've died, right? It's your reward. But it's not to be experienced until later. Here she says, instead of getting to heaven at last, like eventually, right? She says, I'm going all along. What do you think she means by that? Yeah, I think she means she's experiencing beauty, heaven. She's communing with God, with the divine, every single day. She's experiencing that communion, that worship every day. I'll tell you, Emily Dickinson, she's pretty good. All right, I gotta go. If you're still listening to this, good for you, man. You hung in there.